Okay. Yeah, so the panel discussion is hosted by the Critical Food Studies program. Please, if you haven't seen our website, please do visit it. It's on the flyer that was sent to you. My name is Desiree Lewis, for those who don't know me, and I'll be co-chairing with my colleague, Vasu Reddy, the Dean of Humanities at the University of Pretoria. So, I mean, the panel is obviously prompted by the outbreak of COVID-19, but it's also an attempt to raise broader questions and debates about epidemic shocks in the last few decades. And of course, these shocks in relation to our current dominant food systems, which are driven, as we know, by greed, by the destruction of nature, and which results so often in the poisoning of our bodies and our environment. So we have three excellent speakers today, and I want to hand over soon to Vasu to introduce them. They will speak in consecutive order, and we'll take questions after that. But just before that, I just want to say, I know that there are notes in the chat facility, but just a few things about protocol. We're trying to make this quite interactive. So unlike webinars, we're hearing everybody's sounds and so on. So if people can please remain on mute, especially when the panelists are presenting, and only unmute yourselves when you talk. As I say, Vasu and I will be chairing. So if you urgently need to ask a question or make a comment, even while speakers are speaking, please raise it in the chat facility. Vasu and I will be screening those and we'll summarize them afterwards. But towards the end, we will ask people if they want to actually speak directly, and we'll ask you to raise your hand by using the little menu bar and raising your little blue hand. And Vasu and I will try and coordinate this. So let me hand over to Vasu to introduce our speakers, and thank you so much to all three of you for joining us for this.
Thanks, Desiree. Thanks very much. And it's great to have, I can't see that screener, but I think the numbers are increasing. It's great to have such formidable colleagues and scholars and activists on the panel in a very topical issue. So my job is brief, and I'm describing the bio sketch in the way colleagues have formulated it. And I'm sure in your presentations, you may wish to add more around your location, position, or other bio details that you think are necessary. But let me start out with Psyche Williams-Forson, who's an African-American transdisciplinary humanities scholar and an intellectual activist with years of research and teaching experience on food cultures and the well-being of Black people in the United States. She's also chair of American Studies at the University of Maryland and has an abiding interest in gender, race, and material culture. This is quite a formidable range of interests, and I'm sure we're all looking forward to listening to you, Psyche. She will be followed by Mariam Mayet, who is an activist and founder and director of the African Center for Biodiversity. She's also passionate about the destructive impact of neo-imperialism and neoliberal capitalism on biodiversity, food systems, and public knowledges about food and the environment. Lovely to meet you as well, Mariam. And Mariam will be followed by Carla Tsampiras. I hope I've pronounced that correctly, Carla. Carla is based in Cape Town at UCT and interestingly describes herself as a vegan, feminist, historian who's interested in how constructions of gender, race, and sexuality have shaped research into health and access to healing. Her research interests include health, and it's interesting, dis-ease and society, social histories of HIV and AIDS in South Africa, medical and health humanities, and she's also a founding member of the Medical and Health Humanities Africa Network. She also has an interest in slavery, both the past and present, gender and violence, and global social justice issues. She's also intrigued by the ways in which dominant discourses limit public debate about health and nutrition. And also, very importantly, and perhaps this is also necessary, she tries to practice yoga regularly. She recycles religiously and enjoys being by the sea and spelling women in a variety of ways. So quite a range of colleagues who are going to speak to us. Over to you, Desiree.
Thanks, Vasu. Let me hand it immediately over to Psyche to start us off. Psyche, I think you're going to share your presentation with us. So yeah, I'll hand it over to you.
Okay, excellent. Thank you and good morning or afternoon, I guess, for some of you, or evening, depending upon where you are. Thank you all again for having me share some thoughts on this really illustrious panel. So I think I would start with, in the context of COVID, it's interesting that this conversation dovetails so much with my the work that I'm doing right now and my forthcoming book on food shaming and food policing in Black communities here in the US. But I want to start with just some very brief remarks around what is happening in the US. Let me just make sure. What's happening in the US around some of these food issues. A couple of weeks ago, Health and Human Services Secretary Alex Azar was on Jake Tapper's State of the Union, which is a talk show here in the US through CNN. And he seemed to suggest that underlying health conditions of Americans, in particular communities of color, or what they call minority communities, contributed significantly to the death toll from the coronavirus. And here's his quote, and I'm gonna quote it a little bit at length. Unfortunately, he says, the American population is very diverse. It is a population with significant unhealthy comorbidities that do make many individuals in our communities, in particular African-American minority communities, particularly at risk here because of significant underlying disease, health disparities, and disease comorbidities. And that is an unfortunate legacy in our healthcare system that we certainly do need to address. And that's the end of his quote. Now, Tapper pushed back on Azar and asked him, are you implying that many Americans have died from COVID-19 because they were, quote, unhealthier than the rest of the world? Of course, Azar denied that this is what he was saying. However, he did emphasize that the US had a significantly, and I'm quoting, significantly disproportionate burden of comorbidities, including obesity, hypertension, diabetes, adding that these are demonstrated facts that make us at risk for any type of disease burden. Now, as some of you may know, approximately 17,000 at that time, a couple of weeks ago, African Americans had died as a result of COVID, and that was out of nearly 65,000 deaths, unfortunately. And this was according to the data that was available that included race and ethnicity. More than 80,000 people in total at that time had lost their lives. Now we're over 100,000. So when you put those numbers in context, according to the article, African Americans make up about 13% of the population in those places, with 27% of the deaths for which race and ethnicity is known. Okay, so when we do the math and we hear these kinds of comments, unfortunately, they are very prevalent and they permeate not just politician mindsets, but also our healthcare mindsets. This is, as you all may have heard in the news coming out of the US, this disease and the world over has, but particularly in the US and from my standpoint, has really shined a light on health disparities, the way the health disparities are discussed, the way the health disparities are tended to, particularly among communities of color, Black people in particular. And when I say Black, I'm talking now about African American, but also Black defined people vis-a-vis the African diaspora. So when we think about those conversations, the one thing that immediately comes to my mind is the complete lack of ownership for systemic undergirding kinds of racism, the likes of which we are seeing right now coming out of Minneapolis, that have affected the African-American people on a daily basis. The death of Sandra Bland, Breonna Taylor, and now George Floyd, among the many others who are killed simply for living while Black. As if we can disavow those kinds of atrocities and murders and separate them from our everyday life, of which food is a part. So often I feel when we have these conversations, we tend to want to separate food as if it's this thing off and afar, when in fact, from a material point of view, it is one of the many facets of our lives that we engage in every day. So part of the work that I try to do is around shining that light, making sure that the food studies community, particularly in the US, does not blame obesity, diabetes, and all these things on the food, and not allow folks to put that heavy lifting on food alone, right? Absolutely, we can talk about personal responsibility, but we also need to talk about legacies of trauma, right? And to that end, I also address issues around how do people survive culturally, sustainably, during times of trauma. So during times of a pandemic, hurricanes, Bertha, Katrina, Harvey, what happens when you don't have a collective action from the top that is organized to provide for and help people in need, right? And so when you put all of those things together, you end up with what I think is aptly titled for this panel, Epidemic Shocks. And I'm happy to talk more about that, but I'll just leave that right there for those preliminary comments.
Thank you so much, Psyche. I think it's just, it's really excellent that we are having this kind of comparative conversation, which involves thinking about what's happening in the US and what's happening in South Africa, because what we are seeing is also a very pronounced pathologizing and shaming of certain bodies through the explanations of COVID. And of course, this doesn't get anyone anywhere, and it feeds on all kinds of existing racialized and classed myths. So thank you very much for raising that. It would be great to hear some more about the work that you've been doing. But let's just move on, just for people who have joined us, we're going to move through each panelist rather than take questions, because it'll just be unwieldy. So if you do have comments or questions as people speak, please do use the chat facility. So yeah, let's move on to Mariam.
May need to unmute, I think.
Can you see the PowerPoint?
Yes, yes, we can.
You can. Okay, so I want to thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this panel, and I've long been associated with you in different ways, the critical food studies. So I want to talk about pandemics and shocks in Africa. And I want to talk about this in the context of it being symptoms of industrial agriculture, because we have a long history of working on genetic resources in food and agriculture, very much from the perspective of campaigning against genetic modification of our food. We've had a very strong critique of industrial agriculture, and we want to present our analysis of some of the pandemics and shocks in Africa through the prism of our critique of industrial agriculture. But I want to also link this up with I would like to say, what we're seeing is kind of the failure of Western knowledge systems and its predominance. And why I say this is also informed by the way in which multinational companies have appropriated genetic resources, seeds that were, historically in the commons and under the control of smallholder farmers, and the extent to which Western knowledge systems have played a key role in entrenching their dominance and what we call the technological lock-in of food and farming systems by Western knowledge systems, which, while denigrating traditional and other diverse knowledge systems, particularly in the global South, have also appropriated those. And I want to start off by saying that when we begin to frame some of our discussions in the context of looking at industrial agriculture and not only COVID, but several shocks, particularly pandemics like Ebola, MERS, SARS, and so on, we have seen with crystal clarity in this moment the shattering, the fracturing of the myth, first, that global health expertise is the domain of the North. And the reason why we say this is because many of us around the world have been not only horrified, but astonished. And I think we also experience a lot of agony as we watch particularly countries like the UK and the US needlessly lose lives. And we say that part of this, or some of the reasons underpinning this, is a lot of arrogance, hubris, and the failure of these dominant health systems, and not only health systems, but also those knowledge systems that dominate agriculture, not only discourses, but the trajectory of how we produce food, who owns resources, and the failure of these nations and knowledge systems to acknowledge other knowledge systems in the South. So I think that's come very clearly across to us, and we kind of made those kinds of linkages, those of us who are working in food and agriculture, as we begin to formulate also new thinking around the health food seed nexus. Further, I think that we, a friend of ours who was closely associated with you also at your unit at UCT, Donna, said to us that our critique of capitalist, extractive, so-called development systems based as they are on colonial histories are also a critique of patriarchy. She said it's implicit in the way that we critique it, even though we do it in a political economy way. And that gave me a lot of comfort because we look very clearly at the relationship between extraction and the cost to humans and the environment, and that we understand that this has led not only to gross inequalities, but also to the collapsing healthcare systems that we now cannot fail to ignore. A further framing is that, there's been a lot of discussion about where this virus emanated. And our position is that linked to this capitalist exploitation of nature, knowledge, the environment, what has happened to the privatization of healthcare systems, and now as they move towards developing vaccines. I must tell you, all the vaccines that are coming to the market are all going to be GMOs, genetically modified. As we're moving towards closer towards the linkages with the healthcare crisis, we understand that the virus didn't emanate from a lab, that it emanated from this industrial, capitalist, extractive nature of how we produce food, because it has upset the equilibrium that nature provides. And we have been able to see that there's an inextricable link, not only between COVID, but also Ebola, and even other human infectious diseases like malaria and leishmaniasis infections, to industrial agriculture, and particularly deforestation that has to make way for the expansion of more and more monocrops. And so what we're saying very much is that we see the COVID outbreak, and we can say the same thing for Ebola and other pandemics, is that it epitomizes a complex interrelationship between deforestation, reduced biological diversity, and I'll explain what biodiversity is, ecosystems destruction, and human health and safety. And we, as I said earlier on, our framing is that this is largely driven, and I'm not saying only, because I think mining also has a huge role to play, but industrial agriculture, globalized industrial agriculture, as we understand it, controlled by a handful of multinational companies, has brought into sharp relief for many of us who and what is responsible for this contagion effect. And we say that and I have to also admit that many of us who have been working on industrial agriculture for a long time, we also have to admit that we did not pay enough attention to the warnings given to us by our colleagues like Rob Wallace and others about the health, biodiversity, and food nexus. And they have been saying to us for a while now that you are going to be visited by many pandemics and other zoonotic outbreaks, because it illustrates the complex relationship, as I said, between deforestation and all this destruction going on, and particularly in Africa, and what they describe as the perfect storm for the spillover of diseases from wildlife is, as I said, the cutting into forest for agricultural development, the commodification of wildlife and other sources, and what we're calling today zoonotic pandemics. And as I said, Ebola is a particular example that I want to delve into a little bit more. But now the linkages then with biodiversity loss and erosion. Now, many of us think about biodiversity very much in terms of flora and fauna, and about the diversity in nature, but it also includes microorganisms. Pests and disease agents are also part of biodiversity. And these issues have become very important in the whole vaccine discussion, benefit sharing, and who gets to control vaccine developments, who must pay benefits, who will have IP or intellectual property rights over a lot of the disease agents as they have sequenced the genome. It's all linked to the whole biodiversity discussion, but I just wanted to explain that it's much bigger than just flora and fauna, and we're talking about the great variety of life at the genetic, species, and ecosystems level. So I want to say that many of us are aware of many reports that have been published in the recent past, warning us about the very rapid decline in biodiversity, and they're saying that biodiversity is declining faster now than any other time in history. And the current rate of species extinction is in its tens of thousands of times higher than the average over the past 10 million years, and it's accelerating. Now, there's a relationship, as I said, between industrial agriculture and pandemics. There's a relationship between industrial agriculture, biodiversity loss, and pandemics. And we say that the factors driving the decline in biodiversity in Africa includes monocropping. This is large-scale agriculture, plantations of maize, coffee, tea, a lot of cash crops, cotton, palm oil, and so on. The expansion of sugarcane, timber, intensification of livestock production is all part of it. And we are sitting really on a time bomb, and they are saying in Africa, if we do not halt this biodiversity loss, our region will be faced with many, many outbreaks. Because on the other hand, it's kind of like a cycle, you know, as you lose biodiversity, as you cut forests down, you lose biodiversity, there's a spillover effect. But at the same time, loss of biodiversity and genetic resources also impacts on us as humans, particularly on poor communities. So our diets become poorer, our living conditions become poorer. There's an encroachment on areas with animal populations, and there's an erosion of wild foods and medicinal plants. You know, many, many millions of people on the continent still rely on medicinal plants they harvest from forests for their primary healthcare needs. Because also there's so much privatization of our health systems on the continent due to structural adjustment. And this then, in a way, then raises the risk of chronic and zoonotic diseases and pandemics. So it's kind of another treadmill that we are caught in. Now, I just want to, hone in on Ebola, because, I feel really sad that there's been so much kind of over-investment on so many levels around COVID. But Ebola is like the stepchild of pandemics. And I want to say that Ebola is directly linked to deforestation in industrial monocultures. And we've seen that the biggest emergence of the Ebola outbreak was recorded in West Africa between 2014 and 2016, and it infected 28,000 people with over 11,000 fatalities. And we know that it's linked to, what has happened in Guinea. Guinea was the epicenter for the outbreak. And, Guinea has been plagued with wanton deforestation to make place for large-scale production of rice and coffee plantations. At the same time, smallholder farmers, small producers had, and also women bore the brunt of this expansion because they lost their land. They lost access to their land resources for a traditional foraging ground. There was also extensive mining, logging, agriculture going on. It kind of makes for a heady mix for these pandemics. And researchers have said, and this is a quote, and I will share, we will be publishing a paper soon on the loss of genetic resources in Southern and East Africa, from which I've distilled a lot of this work. And researchers have said that commoditizing the forest may have lowered the region's ecosystemic threshold to such a point that no emergency intervention can drive the Ebola outbreak low enough to burn it out. Novel spillovers suddenly express larger forces of infection. On the other hand, on the other end of the epicurve, a mature outbreak continues to circulate with the potential to intermittently rebound. So this is really very serious. And so I want to summarize some lessons that we've learned and learning, because, I also feel, and I don't know how the rest of you feel, during this time of shocks and lockdowns, and it's been an extremely, extremely difficult time for all of us. We suffered so much sorrow, grief, anguish, despair. But I also want to say that it's been a time of great healing, solidarity, love, sharing, and I also feel we also grew so much as a movement. And I want to share some lessons that we can discuss that we take from this, the COVID, Ebola, MERS, SARS pandemics. The first is, I've already said, that there's a direct relationship between the health of biodiversity, human health and safety, and immunity and human security. That the disruption of traditional protective functions that natural ecosystems play in keeping viral loads at bay, with a consequence in greater human-wildlife interaction and intensive livestock production. The second thing is that factory farm expansion has pushed smallholder farmers to the verge of wildlife habitats, enabling the transmission of pathogens from wildlife to humans directly via intermediaries. And we've seen that already in what has happened when the virus reached the Wuhan market. That in Africa, a region so rich in biodiversity of vertebrate species, we can protect against the leap of vector-borne zoonotic diseases to humans by diluting the risks that humans face from contracting zoonotic diseases, because we must preserve and conserve the biodiversity buffer zones. And we can no longer tolerate the decline in species diversity, ecosystems collapse, and the disruption of wildlife trade also damages this buffer. So some of the things about the way forward is that we really have to, coming back to knowledge systems again, is that, we're going to have to take a clean break from the colonial models of the way we produce food, the knowledge systems that accompany those models of dominance food production, because the food that are being produced is killing us. It's killing the planet, and it's brought us to this point of crisis. And that we have to invest in sovereign systemic solutions to combat the ecological, economic, and health crisis on the continent. They are inextricably linked. And as I said, we will prosper from a clean break from these current systems that are dominated by failed Western knowledge systems, and the tools they employ, the technologies that are being used. And, yesterday we released a paper on some experiments going on in Burkina Faso, where they released a very risky genetically modified fungus in a tent. They would never ever dare do this in the north. They would never, but they do it in Africa because, we're an experimental dumping ground for technologies that are extremely risky. The same group of scientists also want to release gene-drive mosquitoes in Burkina Faso, and this is based on an extinction technology. And this project is funded by the Gates Foundation and the US military. And so they want to use Africa to deploy dangerous technologies on the basis they want to solve health crisis on the continent. And so this is why I wanted to make these linkages with knowledge systems, because we have to turn it on its head and say that actually, even the response by Asian countries and African countries to the COVID crisis has so many lessons for the North to take from. And we must have a deeper discussion about that. I'm not a health expert, but I want to say that it's a moment for us to reflect also on the dominance of Western knowledge systems, and that we need to transition. We honestly, we cannot on the continent, we cannot afford to lose any more forests. We cannot afford to lose any more of our ecosystems. We cannot afford ecosystems collapse. Actually, our very survival as Africans depend on our ability to force a transition out of industrial agriculture, to diversify agroecological systems. And here we're thinking not about a one size fits all and say, oh, all of us must plant quinoa tomorrow. No, we must work within the systems that smallholder farmers already have. Build on that diversity, build on the knowledge systems there, build on what women are harnessing, they're custodians of seed knowledge systems, build on there, build on the diverse knowledge systems, including, as I've said, those held and nurtured by women, African women. We need to, in the context of health, recognize this complex interrelationship between human and animal health, plant health, and our shared environment, including our shared and common future. And at this time, this will take a long-term and intergenerational strategy, and we need to take into account intergenerational costs and consequences for the people and nature, for any kind of development interventions that will come in the future. Like I said, in Africa, I've been working on genetic resources a lot in food and agriculture, but there's a lot of genetic resources that are really important to our people found in forests, but also the functions, the buffer zone functions, the functions in its own right that nature performs needs to be, and I don't want to sound, I'm not one of those eco-fascists that I want to protect the environment at all costs. Now I'm saying that we have reached a tipping point. We actually can't afford to lose any more of our ecosystems and our biodiversity, because we must have a different approach now. We have to reintroduce biodiversity buffer zones of widely diverse species, varieties in livestock, more diversity in poultry, more diversity in seed, more diversity with livestock and crops reproducing on site. We need to harness diversity. Diversity is everything. And pass on the immune capacities in nature to the next generation. There's an inextricable, beautiful relationship between all of this and our children. We need to, I think, in this time, we're going to do a lot of damage control. We're going to stave off a lot of evil that will come to us. As capital reconstructs itself, they will buy each other, they will save each other, they'll buy each other up, they will rescue each other. More evil will come, but we will stave it off, but we will make place for enough space for the next generation to be able to build on our good work and the good lessons that we will take from this time to increase our disease resistance and other forms of resistance. And so I say that that's the end of my long speech, and I'm sure that I took more time. So I'll leave it there, and I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mariam. I think that I really valued the way that Psyche raised the significance of thinking very critically about knowledge systems and the way in which certain bodies are pathologized, and the stereotyping that has now become hegemonic in the context of explanations of COVID, and the way that you spoke directly to that, to unearth what is actually being buried, including what's being buried under the guise of finding so-called solutions. So it would be, I really hope that we will have more discussion about the so-called solutions and the, that are being offered by way of pharmaceutical companies and, you know, investing in all kinds of cures, which are, as you say, highly toxic. I think it's a good moment to shift on to Carla, whose focus is very much health, not mainstream health. So Carla, let me hand over to you before we start taking questions. Let me just remind people, I don't see many comments or questions in the chat. I'm sure there's lots that's surfacing for you. Please jot them down. Vasu and I will try and coordinate them after Carla's spoken.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for having me as part of this panel. The thing that I was struck with when looking through the questions that we're beginning to interrogate in the system were the notions of the connections between our present-day food systems and cultures and health epidemics. And that got me thinking around the ideas of health and environmental crises and epidemics, but also specifically about the temporal dissonance between ongoing crises and crises that are made and manifested as urgent and extreme because they are what we're dealing with in the kind of here and now. So one of the things that's been interesting in terms specifically of crisis and food during COVID is the often commentated in social media spaces and others context between, sorry, I just want to say, Mariam, I don't know if you know your screen is still shared. So I don't know if there are video, if there are people's emails you don't want us to see, then that would be the time. So if we think specifically about food at the moment, one of the things that's been an interesting contradiction on social media, for example, are the parallel discourses of people being concerned about weight and health because of excess consumption of food in a situation of lockdown mediated by the emotional responses that come from being in an unusual and an emergency state, with the parallel concerns about the increasing lack of access to food services by people who are already suffering from food insecurities or food instabilities and unable to ensure basic daily nutrition. And in that kind of context, there have often comments that struck me as quite bizarre of people speaking about, oh, but it's so incredible to see this happening right now. Okay, hang on, I'm being asked to be visible. Let me see if I can make myself visible. There we go. So there is this increasing interest in suddenly being concerned about food distribution, yet none of this is new. We have known for years and years. We have seen from those covers that came out in the late 90s, early 2000s, this vast disparities between the food that we have available as a planet and the health epidemic we face, both from excess food and from too little food. So if we think about the current crisis and the intense desire at the moment to make sure that we are addressing what seems to be a current contemporary moment, it does two things. The one is that it keeps us focused on the crisis in the immediate space, which on one level is required and needed because that is, sorry, my connection is dropping. It keeps us focused on the crisis at the moment because that's what's needed on one level. But it takes from our memory the idea of how sustained and systemic these inequalities have been. So in thinking through that and thinking through this question, I was thinking about what is it that connects these present day food systems and epidemics and health and food. And a number of things came to mind. The first is pace and pressure. What we've seen both in healthcare sectors and in food production and food consumption is a ratcheting up of time and a ratcheting up of production, an idea of constant production, constant consumption. And in the healthcare system, an idea of increasing access for those with money and providing more and more types of services. And if you think here about the expansion of apps, for example, that track pretty much everything, what you buy, what you do, where you go, how far you walk, and then attempt to reward in that space, these ideas of increasing the pace at which we do things and which we live our lives. Also, at the same time as there are increased demands on people to work longer for less. So we see this constant push of pace and pressure, both in how we produce food, but also in how we eat it. So, you know, there's much work being done on the rise of the kind of notion of the fast food nation. And in urban areas, that's often more prevalent than in rural areas. But there is a fundamental shifting in time and space in our understandings of our relationship to food and food production and healthcare that has come with the incredible push that is a product of a kind of late neoliberal capitalist expansion. The other things are the practices of health and healthcare and the practices of food production and consumption. So if we think of healthcare practices, if we watch public healthcare, the efforts to dissolve or dilute or in some ways undermine or destroy, or at the very least not sufficiently support public healthcare spaces, we see that the demands made on healthcare practitioners to provide healthcare if we just take one level, one types of healthcare in terms of biomedical healthcare, have been increased, and so increased pressure and often decreased abilities to provide healthcare because of other factors linked to the market and healthcare practitioners. Similarly, in terms of food and food production, the quest and the drive, and Mariam, I think, will be able to speak more fully on this, of the desire for higher yield seeds. So the entire pressure to produce more in less time, to help more people in less time, but also to do so in cost-effective manners, has been an ongoing impetus that continues to feed into these ideas of pace and pressure. The other issue that becomes clear is that the parallel between the health and environmental crises and epidemics are linked to the proliferation of inequalities for profit. So the Oxfam reports that have come out over the last few years, which showed, already in 2015 that the richest 1% of the world's population had more wealth than the remaining 99%. The more recent articles that have spoken about the gendered nature of care and care provision and the impact of that on ideas of financial independence, those proliferations of inequality that we put forward in terms of how employment is being reorganized, in terms of not providing support for people who are responsible for picking fruit, for example, for perpetually ensuring that there are growing resentments and almost active hatred being inspired against groups of people. So this is sometimes on race, sometimes on class, sometimes on gender. But you see this proliferation of inequalities, and all of it, of course, rooted in the request for profits. Alongside that is something that, Des, you've touched on, and I think Psyche also touched on, was the pathologizing of groups of people for political expediencies. So we've seen, as we do in most epidemics, that there are various points where people are blamed. In some epidemics, these have been others that are considered minority groups. In this contemporary discussion, the blame has been passed on to people based on nationalities, it's been passed on people based on racial, ethnic identities, but there's also been a very, very strong class element that's linked to the ideas of people being unhealthy because they choose to be unhealthy. So there's a dialogue of health and wellness that is often removed from the realities of financial inequalities that make it impossible to have healthier food or take care of oneself in a way that is deemed appropriate. So you see this pathologizing, and in some ways also a form of resurrecting of eugenic style thinking. So Psyche, the comment that you made about Alex Azar, and also interestingly, the connection there that there's this discussion and exploitation of an idea of blame on a group of people that can easily be linked to racism from the same man who has spent much of his life being a big pharma lobbyist. So the way in which these increased emotive engagements with groups of people is linked directly to, behind that, drives for more and more profit. So I think those ideas of pace and pressure, practice, the proliferation of inequalities, and pathologizing for political expediency are connecting factors that are evident in specific ways in COVID, but can also be tracked kind of historically through many other health crises linked to both human and non-human health connections. So, for example, if you look at things like the rinderpest epidemics or the outbreaks of trypanosomiasis, the sleeping sickness, because of tsetse fly outbreaks, you start noticing that there are similar patterns, almost identical to what Mariam has been talking about, when there have been moves towards land grabs, towards the productions of monoculture to meet specific capitalist or global imperatives for certain types of products. You see these disruptions break out and affecting populations of people and populations of non-human animals. So there are connections here both in terms of what and how we eat, and in terms of the distribution levels that have carried that through for increasing, for, well, I want to say almost ever, apart from organizations or communities that are organized in more equitable ways, but certainly in capitalist contexts, where there have been ongoing uses of food and the desires or access to food and the production of food to ensure up power for some and keep others focused on the basics of survival. And those play out in different ways over time. And it's one of the things I think we're maybe becoming more acutely aware of now, in ways that we haven't previously, because perhaps we are all inside and trying to think through what this means for us and for ourselves. But what becomes blatantly obvious is that these mass agro-industrial complexes are not only responsible for this immediate health crisis, but for the ones that have been going on and have put us into the current states of mobilities and comorbidities. So the irony of people being held accountable for comorbidities that are often directly the result of fast food and agribusiness is in fact staggering. And of course, last year's 2019 Food in the Anthropocene Eat Lancet Commission which spoke particularly around this and was the first commission of its kind to bring together such a diverse number of specialists, spoke directly to this. Our current food systems and the way we eat have been killing us. And now we have a context where we have that and a new epidemic. And those things are coming together, specifically in this particular moment. In the thinking through the emergency of health epidemics, there is a cautionary note that I'd like to sound. What we've seen previously in epidemics is that because they're often, and arguably rightly, driven by medical intervention and responses only, they tend to focus on the here and now of the emergency crisis. So they're not letting people die here and now of this specific thing. What they often then fail to do is to make the broader connections that have brought people to a particular point where they might be facing death as a result of a particular epidemic. So we saw this with HIV and AIDS, where the obsession was around, sexual immorality, and there were specific carvings of discourses around that. And in the focus of trying to stop people dying then and there, for many of the activists and non-biomedical people who were trying to speak about the complex interrelationships of why it was that people couldn't negotiate condom use, or how it was difficult to talk about sexual health when it was illegal to be gay, how those complex social dynamics that also shape epidemics feature and are engaged are often ignored and sidelined. So it's been interesting in the COVID pandemic that there's been a slightly different take, in the sense that there has been an engagement with the ideas that people would need support because there would be deep impacts in terms of basic health and sustenance. And so, the COVID grants for the 350 Rand that they provide are recognitions of some of this. And yet focusing only on the epidemic, and I'm not saying that we mustn't focus, I'm saying we must focus on it for the people who are most able and capable of focusing on the direct health needs need to be focusing on that. But those of us who are not those people and who have other skills need to be thinking through the complex interrelationships of this. The hunger and the malnutrition in South Africa is ongoing and has been around for ages. The global inequities in food distribution have been around for ages. People have been working on these issues. They are highlighted now, but we need to keep building those connections, because the epidemic is about an epidemic, but it's also about the quiet, less visible, less disruptive epidemics that go on in parallel. Yep. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carla. I think you've picked up really usefully in ending on Mariam's remark that we really need to pay attention to the fact that this is not in many ways a surprise. This is not a sort of a standalone shock. It is in many ways been totally predictable. So I see that there have been not that many questions. So I think I'm going to invite Vasu. What's your sense? I'm going to invite people who have posted questions to raise those themselves, since it doesn't need to be mediated. So
Yeah.
Mark, one question came from you and one question came from Lynn. So Mark, do you want to just rephrase your question or maybe elaborate on it? Because I see you posted some comments there.
It's been something bothering me for a while, coming from a background where I've worked also in humanitarian work. You know, at which stage do we really call for international intervention in countries like the USA? So hearing again about the impact on the African-American community, and I was reading an article this morning in the BBC about how it's minorities in the UK who are dying at twice the rate of the sort of white population in the UK. So it's vulnerable groups who are suffering because of incompetent and self-serving leadership. It's elite leadership that seems to have really no interest in those more vulnerable groups in those countries and is letting people die at a far higher rate than necessary. You know, imagine if it was an African country and you say 100,000 people have died while the leadership prevaricates or talks complete nonsense as Trump does. There would be talk in the UN about how we should intervene in that situation. And so, yes, there's something tongue-in-cheek in what I'm asking, which is when, you know, isn't it time for international intervention? But it's also serious because people are dying, and it's largely because of an incompetent and self-serving leadership. So we should be raising the stakes, you know, we should be raising the debate. Are we going to then have a world system where we say, okay, 100,000 people can die and we don't worry about it? What are the implications of that? Thank you.
Maybe we could go to Lynn, take a cluster, Des.
Yes, I think that's a good idea.
Yeah, to Lynn, and then maybe there's somebody who would like to raise their hand. Maybe Lynn, you could just reformulate in a way what you want specifically. I would suggest that colleagues keep the questions quite brief, because if you want to provide a comment, I think that's also fine.
Okay, thank you very much for giving me the floor. My short question is really on the systematic solutions that Mariam is talking about. Can you name a few? That will be the shortest version of what I'm thinking. Okay. So we have a situation in Africa where there's also, there are actually calls to develop agriculture so that a lot of people can be fed. And so there's a commodification of agricultural practices themselves at the expense of what is there already in terms of indigenous knowledge. So my question really is, when we talk about the clean break, what are some of the solutions you can see on the table in the African context?
Perhaps if there's one more, we could take that as a cluster of 3 and then give our colleagues an opportunity to speak. Is there anyone who wants to raise their hand?
If there's no one, then I will just raise these questions. Something that I've been thinking about a lot. So, I mean, I think all 3 speakers spoke about the way in which, certain groups are seen as, just kind of stigmatized and stereotyped. And I was thinking about how at the outbreak with the fixation with the wet market and, the sort of so-called bizarre food practices that occurred at the wet market, just the way in which these myths, which are so obviously outrageous, but just what currency they have. So, I mean, it's something that I've been thinking about a lot, but I'm wondering if each speaker could just comment on that and that kind of myth making. In some ways they have, but yeah, maybe just comment a bit more. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. Maybe we could go with colleagues who would like to start. I think Mariam, there was a question. I think Carla, and certainly Psyche as well. I mean, you probably have opinions responses to all of them, because they touch on all presentations, no doubt. Mariam?
Yeah, so I think that yeah, there's been a lot of discussion around blaming wet markets, and I think that it's, you know, and it's more about the same and not looking at the systemic issues, to divert attention away from wanton destruction of ecosystems, you know, breaking the natural buffer provided by nature. All of these things are very uncomfortable for our government, because we kind of mortgaged our food systems to, you know, some of my friends call it a handful of, you know, a group of mafia that have come to control, you know, all agricultural inputs that serve and buttress industrial agriculture from farm to plate. So I think that linked to the question about, you know, some of the solutions, and the solutions are not coming from me, you know. This is built on the struggles of particularly small producers in Africa. And here we're talking about particularly women, small-scale farmers, pastoralists, small fisher, indigenous people. And, you know, the demands are consistent, and these are about diversified agroecological farming systems that build on local knowledge systems, that do not displace and undermine the social capital built within and by communities, that allows the free and full use and exchange of agricultural varieties, populations, breeds of seed, but also animals among smallholder farmers, communities. There has to be a lot of organizing of the control over public breeding. So-called innovation is presented to us very much again by a handful of industrialists who are supported by a group of, have to be racial here, white men in white coats in white labs in the north, telling us what we can plant, what kind of crops we can plant, what kind of seed we can produce, and under what circumstances. So I think it's about really tackling the issue of power, control, because at the moment, power and control over our food systems are wielded by a handful of multinational companies that control the seed industry, the pesticide industry. There's a couple of multinational companies that ship seeds and commodities around the world. They set the price of they speculate in futures. They determine the price of food products. I mean, for example, Europe will coordinate the import and export of sugar from sugar beet and sugar cane, but they only grow sugar beet, but they control the sugar trade. So there's also issues around looking at how the global trade regime has come to be dominant and how it has determined our food systems. And now is a moment also for us to look at what has happened during the COVID crisis with the disruption of global long supply chains and the extent to which smallholder farmers were able to continue to produce food from their own seed stocks, their own animal stocks. They were able to link up through shorter supply chains with relief efforts, with community-based organizations, with consumers. So, I mean, it's kind of, we have to restructure the whole system. It's not one thing. It's complicated, but we have to start with the power control, We have to build, we have to value in traditional indigenous knowledge systems. So it's a whole lot of things about harnessing diversity, producing on-site. So it's a whole range of things. We have to redraft, I think, all our laws and policies. If we really want some systemic changes, we can't tweak it here and there because it's fundamentally flawed and broken and sick in many ways. And it has precipitated this crisis. And now that we have the crisis and the lockdowns have exacerbated so much of the suffering of people who are already vulnerable. So, you know, the whole climate change issue has to be linked with the transition agenda because, you know, the whole locust infestation in East Africa is linked with climate change, and the solutions being proffered by our governments, the World Food Programme, the FAO, are all quick fix solutions. Let's spray the locusts with pesticides. Let's pollute the rivers more. Let's you know, and the whole pesticide seed industry is captured by industry, and they're siphoning public funds through these disaster relief efforts, through farm input subsidy programs. But at the same time, it's not all gloom and doom because we are out there. Social movements are not doing nothing. They're organizing, they're mobilizing, they're doing things, they're making a plan. And we have to build on what is emerging and the struggles of our time and our people. So I think that all of us have to vigorously defend our spaces. We have to eke back so much of the loss of our rights that you know, we're locked down. We can't move about. We have to eke back just some of the small freedoms. And then we have the bigger task of transformation. So a lot of work to be done in the future. And so we all have to, maybe this respite, maybe we must see this lockdown as respite for us to regenerate ourselves, to reposition, to reorganize ourselves, because I see very exciting things happen because we have now connected with each other and across movements in a way we haven't done for the last 20 years.
Thanks. Thank you, Mariam. What about you, Psyche?
Yeah. So there are a couple of things, I guess, that I would say. First, to address the initial comment that was made about does the U.S. need help, or would we even be in a position to receive help? I think under the current administration, the short answer would be no. Other administrations, perhaps you could see some levels of flexibility. You know, I like these conversations because they give us an opportunity to see macro and micro issues, right? One of the chapters in my forthcoming book, which is titled right now, Eating While Black, Food Shaming and Food Policing in America or in the US. And the title came about long before these incidents of living while Black in the US. And so it's good for me to hear these conversations because so often folks are talking on these macro levels. For me, my interest is really in what do people do in the meantime? Absolutely, our food systems need overhauling in major ways. Absolutely, we need to fight against the power structures and those systems that keep us bound to ill health, to dis-ease, to massive, you know, agro systems that are inequitable, unequal, all kinds of things. But what do we do in the meantime to help people on the ground just get from point A to point B? So again, to circle back to the first response, that help, while it might be needed, is not going to be forthcoming because of the sort of xenophobic, nationalist ways in which the United States positions itself vis-a-vis the world. Okay, that's number one. We have the capacity in the United States, as do many other countries perhaps, to help the people we need to help. That is not in the interest of the power structure, right? We are very much at a classist, racist system that thrives off of keeping people ill, that thrives off of keeping people disenfranchised, that thrives off of keeping people oppressed and suppressed, right? That is not in the interest most often of our governments. It's not in the interest of large agricultural systems. It's not really in the interest of our healthcare system, quite frankly. You have individuals on the ground who care about people, but in terms of where the money can be made, no. Our pharmaceutical industry thrives off of people being ill, right? And creates illnesses so people, or the illusion or the myth of illnesses, so that people can continuously buy into these rhetorics of, oh my God, I have this, I have that, I have this, I have that, and it's connected to my food supply and so forth and so on. So I'm always, trying to have these conversations betwixt and between while we are out there fighting, Monsanto and other large, pesticide companies. And so what do we do to help people in their everyday lives get from point A to point? How do we feed people right now whose lines are miles long because they didn't know a month or 2 or 3 ago that they were going to be needing a food bank in Nevada? They didn't know they were going to be needing a food bank in DC. They didn't know they were going to be needing a food bank wherever the place may be, fill in the blank, right? So, what is the solution? Yes, as was stated earlier, folks are here. Chef Andreas and other tons of organizations are trying to help folks get to the place where they need to be, just so they can come through this situation in some measure of health, right? Whether it's mental health, emotional health, wellness, from a physical standpoint, or what have you. But I like to try to keep these conversations grounded, because the people for whom I tend to want to speak to have no understanding of these larger scale issues that are in the domain of activists and others who are trying to undo the power structures. There are also those local power structures that I think we need to grapple with in our everyday communities that are issuing grants, that are issuing monies to help and assist. How can we even unseat those folks or get them to shift and change? I'm not suggesting we're powerless here. What I'm suggesting is that there need to be some mass movements. Right now, circulating in the US through Facebook and other forms of social media is a complete boycott by Black communities on July 7th, so that this United States can feel the economic power that we possess and what that looks like when we withhold our dollars from these corrupt power systems and structures that seem to feel that we are somehow still in the 1600s, 1700s, 1800s, or in the case of South Africa, in an apartheid state. And again, I have to keep bringing that back to what we're seeing right now in the US around violence against Black bodies, women, men, children, and this disparate, killing and murdering of our bodies as if we don't belong. So all of those issues are intricately tied, and on a very localized level, while I can fight these larger systems, I need to be concerned about how people in our communities right now get access to food during this pandemic, which sometimes has absolutely nothing to do with getting access to food, has nothing to do with whether they're eating healthy or not. They just need to eat in the meantime.
Thank you, Psyche. What about you, Carla?
Okay, thanks for those questions. Des, I want to start with the question that you raised about what are the myths that are currently circulating that make some of the comments around Wuhan and the wet market, and why those things allowed to be there. And, I think it's the case that in epidemics, the dialogues of discrimination that are in place are rapidly and quickly deployed. And, we have a long history of kind of what Zaid would call talk in terms of relation of Orientalism, and increasingly the global international power spats between China and the US have seen a lot of this kind of wielding of anti-Chinese sentiments. And so when there's then a need to quickly deploy a myth, it's easy to tap into an existing mythology to do so. And linking into some of the points that Psyche's been making as well, I mean, the reason that you can have a president say, oh, well, a governor is being weak when there's protests in the street because of indiscriminate murder and killing is because there is a particular masculinist, racist mythology that can be quickly deployed to respond to a situation, and does, as they always do, removes an accountability by blaming accountability on other people rather than addressing the issues that are central to creating them in the first place. So, the tussle between Trump and the governor becomes a kind of a tussle of masculinity improving strength, as opposed to systemic racism and other forms of fascism that are going on. Like, your question around how do we take these discussions from the kind of macro level to the micro level, I think is always the tension, and always the kind of the space between the thinking through and the doing. And I see in one of the comments that Mark made that there are, I think, responses that have to be tailored to the specific moments of the time or the context of the time. So I can't speak for everywhere in the country, but one of the things that has been happening here is that there's been literally a kind of pairing of communities with more money with communities with less money. And one of the first things that happened there was distribution of money towards people to either allow people capacity to buy their own food or to try and get nutritious food to places. And in other contexts, and of course these are short term. I mean, this is not a long-term solution. A welfareist handout of food is not a long-term solution. But in terms of dealing with some of the kind of increased necessity for just survival, so before we even think about COVID infection, just actually surviving from today to tomorrow, and bizarrely the epidemic has found a way, has in some ways provided a focal point around people to come together on an existing idea. But yeah, that depends on on what is going on in a particular context, and it's not necessarily the same all over. And the questions of how long it's going to be, how long it's going to be able to last is a much more complex story. So I don't know. I mean, I think maybe it would be interesting to hear from people who perhaps are activists in other parts of the world or the country who are trying to find solutions, because these are not problems that I think we're ever going to solve individually, and it is about that seeking resources where we can and seeking solidarity where we can. Just to pick up, see a comment from Mark around the need to value local food systems and retail. And I think that is something that's been very, very interesting, that especially in urban areas, for the first time, the direct link and understanding of where our food comes from has been brought into quite stark relief. And in some ways, it's a thing cities do. They kind of move through their buying of food. And unless people have a direct connection back to places where food is grown for a household, that sense of connection to food systems can be lost. So I mean, one of the other things that's worked in Cape Town, and again, this is a very small example, so I'm not trying to suggest this would translate to cities elsewhere, but is that there has been a push towards trying to connect small-scale farmers with people, so as close to populations that need food as possible, and facilitating that transportation of food over a shorter distance, rather than the kind of often far more complex and extended food distribution networks that are built into supermarkets and other spaces. So I think it is that question of how do we find out energy to deal with the day-to-day survival and these broader questions. And I think that's partly why a discussion like this is interesting, because those are the facets that we kind of tend to struggle to bring together often.
No, thank you, Carla.
Oh, sorry, Vasu, and I'll co-share. Sorry, Vasu.
Can I just follow up for a minute to add one more layer here, if I may? We toss around, I think, often words like nutrition and health and nutritious food and healthy food and good food. What do those terms mean? This is the thing about food, I think, that's so fascinating and frustrating simultaneously. When we're talking as professionals who work in food, we use a lot of terminologies that we take for granted. And this is part of my argument in the United States. What does nutrition look like? Or what does nutritious food look like for someone in the South versus someone in New England versus someone who has migrated here or immigrated here from Guatemala or from Ghana or from Liberia or where have you? What does that look like? And how is that tied to sustainability and to thriving as a person, as a part of a community, and further complicated during the middle of a pandemic? I don't think we can talk in terms, and again, this is the beauty and the frustration of food. We talk so much on the macro as if everybody is on board with the same concept of what food is, with no regard, it seems to me, for taste or preference or region or gender or what labor looks like in the acquisition and preparation and so forth of food. And it's difficult to have these conversations. Yes, that is the tension, absolutely. But I aim to, in my work, keep people aware of that tension, because when you lose those tensions and you start talking on these levels that sometimes totally erase people, that's when we can also easily fall prey back to these notions of systemic inequalities, because we've left the people, right? And we're talking about systems only. So I would just, from my point of view, like to be reminded that I need to know what nutrition looks like. What does healthy look like? When we're talking about food. To lose that means we lose the people, in my estimation, and it means then that we're talking about abstracts.
Thank you.
That's what we want to interject.
No,
Thanks.
Thank you. I think that also links up so strongly with the importance of really radically thinking about how our knowledge systems work to persuade us and to drown out other ways of thinking, because that narrowly nutritionist way of thinking about healthy food, of course, serves the status quo totally. Ayanda, I know, sorry, Vasu, I just saw.
No, go ahead.
Ayanda wanted to speak. So I'm wondering, we can take another round of questions. So anybody who wants to follow up after Ayanda, I know Mark had a follow-up question, and Pralini too, both directed at Mariam. But Ayanda, go for it.
Thank you, Desiree. A lot of the discussion has already touched on my comment, frustration, and question, which is around what Mariam was talking about in terms of the power and control of food production by industry and the need to diversify local diets and empower or put at the center the local knowledge systems and harness the knowledge systems of women and local farmers. And in South Africa particularly, poor rural women are confined in spaces that are not productive, in land that cannot be productive because of the historical dispossession of indigenous peoples. And my frustration and question is, how do we do that in real terms? How do we support local women in producing food and not have a conversation about the political will to address the issue of land? populations have been completely marginalized and excluded from, you know, a capacity to produce their own food. Instead, what the government has done is it has promoted the commodification of food and this transactional system by providing people with social grants, not land, not agricultural support and education, not, you know, I mean, I appreciate the 350 to people who cannot afford food, especially at this time. But I'm also frustrated that what that does is to support industry, support the industrial food production and all the extractive systems that that has brought us to this moment. So that's my frustration about thinking about a way forward in the context, in this political context and economic context. I don't think that we can resolve this problem at the local level without the political intervention.
Yeah, I think possibly Psyche might want to pick up on that with reference to the US context, although I think in many ways she has spoken about trends there as well as Mariam. But I've had another request from Nkosi wants to also ask a question, so if we can take one from her and then give it back to the panel. Nkosi, are you there?
Yes, thank you. So I'm so appreciative of this convening, and I have a question particularly for Psyche, and I'm so appreciative of where you went, Psyche, in terms of the specificity. My question is around pan outward to talk about the food restaurant industry. And so we know in the US that there is a racial disparity of those who have contracted coronavirus as well as those who have died among African Americans. Psyche, your work is so important because you talk about the centrality of food, particularly chicken, in the lives of African Americans and sustaining a particular life. And I think about how food enable people to build businesses, African Americans to build businesses. A few weeks ago, I read an article that discussed how food, Black women restaurateurs would be hit the hardest. So my question is really that, what do you think is the future of Black restaurateurs in light of COVID? You know, there are data that tells us that African Americans are less likely to get loans, and higher, when they do, they get higher interest rates and different things like that. So there already is inequality that exists, and this pandemic exacerbates that. But what do you think is the future of Black restaurants in the US particularly? Thank you.
Oh, okay. I wasn't sure if I should respond or if you wanted to take any additional questions, Desiree.
Okay. I think there was Pralini had one. Pralini, are you still around? Do you remember your question? She made a note.
I think she just made an observation, a comment, I think.
Yeah,
but I think Psyche.
Okay, so I would tie both of the question. Thank you for both questions. I want to tie the two together. I'm also very appreciative of this conversation because while you all are talking a lot about land and acquisition, and we have similar arguments here in the US, right? As you know, perhaps African-American farmers and farmers of color are least likely to be given farming grants, or as was said by the speaker, any sort of assistance with agricultural practices. But the thing I would also like to jump on very quickly and then come back around briefly to address the Black restaurateur question is that there has been a push in the United States in the last decade, which is another chapter in my book, about growing one's own food. And that push has come across the board in terms of race and ethnicity. And one of the things that I like to suggest to people, there was an early argument that a lot of African Americans don't want to grow their own food because it's too reminiscent of enslavement and eras of sharecropping and so forth, which is the historical legacy of racial oppression here in the United States, understood. And yet there are quite a few others who do want to grow one's own food, right? Part of what I try to suggest is that by pushing the mantra of grow one's own food, we are again eclipsing the ways in which people access food, right? Most of the cases of COVID in the United States are in urban centers. It was stated not long ago that in order for the economy to get back up and running, it's interesting, in order for economies to get back up and running, what the government really needs to see is the action of cities, right, moving forward. And most of those cities happen to vote blue, and they happen to largely be Democratic, and they are inhabited by many people of color. All right, so when you think about all of that, how people access food in the US is so not necessarily tied to agriculture. You might get it from a corner store, from a bodega, from a neighbor, from a shared community garden, and yet there's this huge push, again, in terms of the rhetoric, that you should grow your own food, you should eat local, you should do all of these sort of mantras that are very much tied to moralizing here in the United States and how one sees themselves as a good citizen. When the reality is much more complex than that, right? And what we tend not to do as, sometimes as scholars, but certainly as activists and so forth, is we tend not to allow that diversification by people, because then we'll say, well, that'll lead you to eat poorly, or it'll lead you to do this, or it'll lead you to do, as opposed to recognizing, again, that food is one of many objects that we interact with on an everyday basis, just like our clothes, just like our telephones, just like the things we have in our homes. I try to remind people of that because, again, we can start talking about food in the abstract as if it's not tied directly to our very complex personhoods, as you know, as is described, right? So we have so much moralizing that goes on here around what is good food and how agriculture is the only way to get good, healthy food. So I wanted to put that out there, and I want to tie that back to the restaurant industry. Black folks have always been, in America, have always been sufficient about how they navigate food spaces. It is a complete myth to assume that during enslavement, when you are surrounded by forestry and you are surrounded by woods, that the only food that you can conjure up is that which was given to you by the person who was enslaving you. That's ridiculous. If you are living around berries and nuts and seeds, you mean to tell me that folks don't have the wherewithal to figure out so that they get the foods that they need? Absolutely they do. Now, does that mean that we're eating high on the hog? Absolutely not. But people were resilient. When we remove that element of survival, we instill a myth of lack, and we perpetuate a myth that these people are victims and that they need this assistance, and that the only way they're going to survive is if we take care of them, and so forth. Now, I'm not suggesting at all that we haven't been, again, left out of every conceivable social system here in the United States. Of course we have, from redlining to gentrification to land access. African Americans, Black folks are absolutely left out. But we also know how to survive. So while we are dying highly, disproportionately in the United States, we also know how to survive. You know why? Because we are perpetually cast down in the United States. So all these folks running around, I don't want to wear a mask, I don't want to do this, I don't want to do that. That's privilege, right? We know what it means to be subdued. We know, and we're like, you know what? If that's what's going to get me healthy, that's what I'm going to do. There's been a whole conversation of late by spiritual leaders in the United States who say, absolutely not. We're telling you right now, don't think you're going back to a physical house of worship, because you're not. We're not going back until the White House opens up, because we're very much aware of how these systems are operating. This is why we're calling for this mass boycott. Now, to your point about Black restaurateurs who have struggled, scrapes and scrap to get to where they are, only to see this particular situation almost completely wipe out their livelihood, you're right. It's horrible and horrific. However, ideas are coalescing. How do we come together, perhaps, and maybe not have so many restaurants, but pull our resources together to have one? How do we recast ourselves? How do we remarket ourselves? How do we resituate ourselves? Yes, there are going to be some that will be lost, but overwhelmingly, I would argue that Black women are going to figure out a way to make it work. They're going to, because historically, that's what we have done. Generationally, that's what we have done. With and without the help and aid of the United States. Would it assist us? Absolutely. But as soon as those monies were released, we knew we were going to be last in line to get them. We can't rely upon the government. We never could. And so I would argue that it's a wait and see, but I know for a fact, based on some reports that have come across my inbox in the last several weeks, that conversations are already taking place between and among the Black Restaurant Association and in communities about how do we make sure that these folks do not fail. So again, in all of these conversations at the local level, it's important for us to be reminded of the resiliency of our histories and how those histories are going to sustain us through this incredible crisis that affects us at so many different levels, often disproportionately. Yep.
Thanks, Psyche. I think it was while you were speaking that Tracy put something in the chat section. Tracy, do you want to say a bit more? I wasn't sure that I could follow the comment.
Oh yeah, sorry. I'm probably distracted today. So I'm writing from Minneapolis, which, as I suspect some of you know, is undergoing an insurrection right now as lots of different people take action against businesses and institutions and spaces that have excluded them or practiced racialized violence against them, especially in particular, the police station from which the officers went that murdered George Floyd is across the street from a large shopping center that has a Target store, which is like mostly dry goods, but some groceries, really large mass market store, and also a Cub food store, which is our big supermarket chain. Both of those stores were burned, I believe. I don't know that they've been burned to the ground, but they're gone. And both Target and I think also Cub have also closed all of their stores around the city because they've become such targets of violence right now. And so that has led to this predictable response, which is a lot of people saying, why are they hurting? You know, why are people doing this? They're hurting themselves. They're hurting their own neighborhoods. They're making their own neighborhoods into food deserts by burning down these stores, without realizing that many people in these neighborhoods never fully depended on these stores for food, because these stores' models don't fit their lives. So it's always interesting, whereas these stores did expropriate capital from these neighborhoods. So these stores depend on these neighborhoods for capital, although people in these neighborhoods do not, in fact, entirely depend on stores like this for their daily supplies. I'm not in any way diminishing the loss. This is a hard day to be in Minneapolis, but I think that critique that when people burn down, at least these sorts of businesses, that they're hurting themselves, really misses the point that Psyche was trying to make, which is that these places, these sorts of mass market stores anyway, take capital out of neighborhoods, whereas people in these neighborhoods are not, in fact, always as dependent on these stores as it seems.
Thank you very much, Tracy. It must be really hard right now. And I think that what you're saying and what Psyche is saying resonates so strongly for us in South Africa. It's exactly the same situation. And I think somebody else might want to pick up on this. But I see that there's another question from Linda. Linda, do you want to just raise it yourself?
Yes, and again, I'm sorry I came in a bit late if you already addressed this. And I did want to also thank, I don't remember his name, the man who said that, you know, when should we intervene in the United States? About 100,000 deaths, because 2 of those were in my family. And just what do we do with white entitlement? How do we deal with changing attitudes? America was built on accessible, cheap food. I mean, things like bananas have always, the banana industry has said they will always cost less than apples. But Americans are used to getting any food, anytime, and rock bottom prices built on the bodies of labor of people of color. And in coronavirus time, again, you know, Psyche was talking about these, you know, people out there don't want to wear a mask and just not being sane. So how can we try to change these attitudes when the majority of consumers have no incentive to change?
Sorry, I realized that I was on mute. I wonder if we can't open this again just to the panel. Mariam, do you want to respond to anything that's been said at this stage, Mariam? And because I mean, you know, the parallels between the US and South Africa are just so incredibly similar right now. Mariam and Carla.
Carla, you can go first.
Are you sure, Mary? Shame, I feel like there's questions that you had from the previous round that you hadn't had a chance to answer yet.
It's fine. We still have time. You go ahead.
Okay, thank you. I think there's a number of things. I mean, the thing I want to go back to is Ayanda's discussion about the politics of land. And indeed, I mean, this is a global question, and it has a very specific resonance in South Africa. The way we understand soil and land and ownership and use has been put into this particular point where either it's agricultural business or it's excluded and taken from people. And that ties with the complexity, though, that Psyche raises around people need land and must have land, and we need to seriously discuss land distribution. But there also shouldn't be an assumption that everybody must be responsible for their own food production, if that everybody is not actually everybody. And we're not saying if you live in a balcony in a flat, you have a responsibility to grow food. And there needs to be a kind of cautious I suppose, engagement with the institution of food production, so that it doesn't add to women's burdens particularly. Because a lot of the production of food, as you say, and in places where the land is not suitable, where the labor required to produce basic food takes more energy, takes more time, assumes that women are responsible for that and must go out and do that and should somehow have an affinity for producing food that they may not have. So there's a tension between supporting people who are drawn to grow and to produce, and ensuring that there's a responsibility for people who eat that produce in a way that doesn't shift burdens of labor onto women who can't afford to buy their way out of it. Because one of the things that you've seen, you know, what has been interesting in COVID and food and what could be bought and what could not be bought under lockdown was how class dynamics played out. So, you know, you have people complaining that they can't get rotisserie chicken when, you know, other people are trying to survive on 350 Rand. So the ideas of convenience of food and food access removed from the realities of what it means to go out day after day, you know, in all sorts of weathers to try and produce food on land that is unyielding, needs to be very carefully woven into these discussions. And the bigger question, and this is the one that you know, I think is difficult to talk about at all, is, are the ideas that we have about ownership of land okay? Because the problem and the reasons for the original taking of land was because of a change in an idea of land, not as something that should be valued and shared, but as something that should be owned. And so how do we compensate for rash, you know, racist land seizure in a point in the global history where there's a pushback to the ideas of ownership and discussions about the commons, that resources that sustain us, air, water, land, should be held in common. So those kind of tensions play out. But I think you're absolutely right. There's no ways we can talk about land and food without talking about restitution and addressing and redistributing land in this country. Because, and yeah, so that's one component part of what I wanted to say in terms of questions that have come up. Because the burden of food production is intense, and we know that both in terms of actually producing food, so on small scales, but also in terms of often having to acquire and prepare food, there's very specific gender dynamics to that. And inherent in all of this is a food system that's built on various forms of violence against the planet, against different species, against the people working on food production, against people consuming, against people in advertising. There is a particular demarcation and rearticulation of violence at various degrees. And what a thing I kind of struggle with is, how do we get to a point where food production, access, consumption, ability to eat food is something that is built on joy rather than violence? Because our current systems, particularly the mass agriculture systems, don't really allow for that. We, in some senses, ingest the violence of the production that goes on, from, you know, the monocrop of the tree that is cut down and then planted over, to people's loss of capacity to be on a land that can sustain, to the destruction of land to the point that, you know, soil is so dead and depleted that we can't actually grow nourishing foods anymore because we're killing soil and the microorganisms in them. So those very complex associations of production and responsibility, and also that there, and I think Psyche, you touched on this as well, this idea, and it's interesting because it's paralleling in some of the responses that are happening now, that lockdowns are being released in certain countries. This discussion of the responsibility for health being on the individual. So yes, of course there is, you must wear a mask, like in South Africa, that's very clear. And Linda, the point you make about privilege, I mean, I think there's a lot of that playing out in some of the suburbs, the wealthier suburbs, at least in Cape Town. So people who seem to have an idea that because they have private healthcare, it doesn't matter, they don't need to wear a mask, and they're disassociated from their responsibility to other people around them because of an idea, I think, of privilege providing extra protection. So there are those things definitely playing out. So there's that tension between the responsibilities we have as individuals and not shifting burdens of production onto people who have the least time for them or the least resources, or should be being demanded to do it, or shifting responsibilities of production onto people who may not want it. So those tensions play out in how we have to try and rethink these complex interactions between food production, consumption, and distribution. Thanks.
Mariam?
Yes, thank you so much. I think Mark made some important contributions about, what became, I think, very visible to many of us, particularly government, who I think didn't want to see the invisible or made people invisible, the homeless, the extent of the homelessness in this country, the extent of the unemployment, all this became very visible to our government, and they began to talk then about localization. So even the agribusiness is talking about a shift towards more local food systems, because they understand how fragile the long global supply chains are, and if we are going to be facing more pandemics and disruptions in the future, their own survival will depend on their own localizations. Is how they're interpreting a transition towards localization, and they're looking at it very much in terms of how they can continue to control. Now, the control is not just over land, but it's also over water. Water is a critical component of our food system. So issues around water, extension service, all of these become very important. And I think that it will take a tremendous effort on our part to shift even our government out of their paradigm of wanting necessarily to link smallholder farmers and small food producers into corporate value chains. They can't see it any other way. They have no faith in agroecological, diverse, autonomous farming systems. And I have to also say that when we talk about our food system, we're not only talking about food producers. There are many, many other players in the system. So it would be, not only small-scale farmers, but also small enterprise distribution agents, multiple diverse homesteads, small food manufacturers, agro-processors, street traders, spaza shops, localized and indirect exchange, local food markets. It's a diversity of players and nodes that have not been supported at all by our government, but exist on the margins of our food system. And I think that the response is very much by the C19 coalition, who stepped in to try to perform some of the social welfare functions that our government was just unable to perform, because they put in place absolutely no social safety nets when the lockdown was imposed, gave people 24 hours, and later on began to make some sort of assistance available. These groups began to make inventories of smallholder producers, began to link up small producers, small enterprises that exist even under the most difficult conditions and circumstances. So there are some things to build on, and I think we have to think about new systems built around democratic values. We have to democratize our food systems, and this means, as others have spoken about, how we will not be able to do. We can't have a coexistence with industrial agriculture that's built on this violence, this exploitation of nature, knowledge, that's built on dominance, control, exploitation through commodification, either through intellectual property rights or the nature of knowledge systems and lock-ins that they control. So, you know, we have to make a clean break with that. And that's why some of the agroecological struggles are so threatening for the industry, and they've now begun to co-opt the agroecology discourse. And they've been so audacious as to write that GM cowpea, genetically modified cowpea, and cowpea is indigenous crop to Africa, we are scent of origin, is part of agroecology because it's nitrogen fixing and you don't have to use more pesticides. So I think the battle is going to be quite bloody with the industry in the future. They will battle it out with us. They have received a lot of bailouts. They've depleted the public purse. And I fear that if we don't organize ourselves during this time, so that when the lockdowns, you must remember that we can't get on the ground. We are locked down. We are having a lot of webinars. We're talking a lot to each other, which is really important because we are organizing and mobilizing and making it clearer in our minds and our struggles how we want to position ourselves. But we were unable to reach out to the farmers in the Eastern Cape because they don't have smartphones. The technologies that we have access to, you can't organize online. So there's limits to our preparedness now. And I really worry about the future because we're confronting a lot of unemployment. We are confronting, you know, a lot of small businesses have gone out of business. So what is going to happen then to this missing middle? The corporates are going to buy them out already. Corporate lawyers have been telling our Competition Commission that you're going to have to be very liberal in your interpretation of the failing firm defense, because many firms are failing and you're going to have to allow the buyout of these companies on the basis that you have to secure employment in this country. So I think that the transition is not going to happen, you know, because we will it to, but because we're going to have to struggle for it. And it's going to be not just about land, but about all resources, biodiversity, water. The water rights have already been allocated. Fishing, all of this is disputed and contested, and we must continue to contest it. So I think we all have a clear idea of what the transition should look like and what we should do, and that we require systemic changes, but it will require that we have to break with the current systems, the whole trading system as well is really, you know, we've over-dependence of international trade for food. All of this has also come under a lot of critique. And we have now a new special rapporteur, the United Nations special rapporteur on the right to food. He's a trade person. We will look to him as well to guide a lot of the discussions going forward. We need new governance rules as well going forward, building on the lessons that we are learning now.
Thanks, Mariam. I'm afraid I think we're coming to the end of our seminar, and there are not many questions, but I know there was a comment that Gabby posted. I think it's partly in response to a statement you made, Carla, around the whole narrative around growing your own food does not just have gender and class implications, but also overlooks the realities of disabled people who cannot grow their own food and are already hard hit by a health crisis that especially endangers them. That's perhaps you could respond, but I'm not sure if there are any other questions that people wish to raise their hands. If not, I'm going to ask Gabby, Carla, if you could respond to that and make some brief concluding statements, and then I will turn to our other two speakers, and then we'll round up the session, both Desiree and I.
Yes, I mean, that it's key central point, and I'm a bit embarrassed that I didn't make that obvious statement, because this is the thing. There are generational and ability restrictions that also impact on food production and access. So you have often in these situations, decisions that are made have a very disproportionate effect on people with differing abilities, because there is a kind of discussion about the able body as the body that should survive, and similarly the young body as the body that should survive. So what has been interesting in terms of thinking through those things in relation to COVID particularly, but also in epidemics and health more broadly, is exactly that. It's often that the thing that I started with, that these things are not new, they're just amplified in a context of crisis and epidemic and health crises. So there is this tension between the responsibilities we take as individuals and that responsibility not being placed on individuals, because there are systems that facilitate inequalities of access and food and health, alongside the responsibilities or the responsibilities that we have towards each other. Because we are at some point all going to be older, we're going to be young, you know, we've been younger, there are generational responsibilities. And the thinking through that, the complexities of bringing together those things become key. And yeah, Gabriel, you're absolutely right. The epidemic, there's already been the discussions, you know, there've been the generic discussions about what will doctors do when they have to choose who goes onto a ventilator, and added to that layer already, which is already a terrible situation for healthcare practitioners to be in, are the implications of gender, generation, and ability or disabilities into that context. Because the ideas that proliferate as hegemonic about which bodies are worth saving and which are not have become intensified in a context where there is completely inappropriate responses in some countries around looking after like basic duties of care. So we see pretty much globally that where care is located at the moment is in the profits for stockholders, and at almost all costs. That's where and how decision making is happening. And to shift that to an idea of care that extends between ourselves and beyond that framework is incredibly difficult. In terms of wrapping up, I think, you know, epidemics and food systems both reveal violences, and it's trying to find the spaces where there is not just resistance, but also new ways of thinking about doing things becomes critical. And one of the things that hampers that is that the systems we've set up that have facilitated inequalities and inequalities of access to food means that it's often impossible to imagine what that new world would look like, to imagine what it could be like, because it seems on some days completely and utterly insurmountable. And I think the point that Arundhati Roy made about whether or not this pandemic would be a portal to something new becomes quite central, because there is an odd slipping at the moment of discourse about when things get back to normal. What will it be like when things get back to normal? But there is no more normal. Like, the normal that we had got us here. So how do we realign that idea of normal? And I think that's going to be a really tough question for us to all have to deal with. Thank you.
Thanks, Carla. Mariam, what about you? Some final reflections? Mariam?
Yes, sorry, I was on mute.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I feel quite daunted by the task ahead. I have to say, I have a deep sense that in the time that we were locked down, I feel we lost a lot of time. I, in some ways, feel like we may have been taken back in our struggles quite a few years. Because imagine we come out of these lockdowns, we have to fight first for all the freedoms and rights we lost on the way. With every level, we concentrating on how are we going to survive in this level? What can we do? Can't we do? Just think about it. The impact of having locked down 3 to 4 billion people isolated from each other. Many of us under military dictatorship or rule. And capital has not come to an end. There hasn't been a demise of capitalism. In fact, they reconstructing, reimagining themselves. For example, you see Etihad and Emirates will join into a partnership. Exxon and BP will, they're buying up other companies, they're setting themselves up to merge. They will recover from this crisis much better than we will, I think. So I'm feeling a bit, quite despondent about the future. It will be different, and I think that women, people of color in the US, in particular in the UK, Black communities here, communities in the favelas, the indigenous people in Brazil are bearing the brunt of this crisis. And I don't want to be overly hopeful. I want to be able to be realistic, and I know that we have all these ideas about what has to happen to transform, but I think the road ahead is going to be extremely difficult for us all. The sheer level of unemployment, the mass suffering of people. It's a gloomy future, and I think we need to have clear minds. We need to, as we are trying to do now, to understand what is going on, to keep our minds clear about the systemic problems and be very clear and prioritize the struggles that we must immediately take up. And I feel like we, in this time, will not be able to do more than damage control. I think the new evil that will come and will present itself in a new way will be much more emboldened. They will act with more impunity. They will be opportunistic and expedient and profit from this crisis. And the best we can do is stave off more damage, as I said, and create some spaces for us increasingly to leave for the next generation to be able to survive and continue some form of struggle. I know it's a very despondent parting, but these lockdowns have come at tremendous cost to social movements, So yeah, I would say that we would need to continue to talk, to connect, to share, and have a great deal of energy to rebuild and build on also the energies of our young people, bring them into the movement, harness some of that creativity, work across movements. It's going to be a very difficult couple of years for us all in the movements. So yeah, I don't want to be over optimistic about things, but I think the future is looking quite bleak. I'm sorry to end on such a pessimistic note, but
those are important reflections,
And so I was saying to my friends, I think we've been taken 10 years back in our struggles, maybe more, but I would like to give others to end with a more optimistic note. I mean, I think that, physically we are of the privileged, we are not infected, we were able to lock down. But emotionally, I want to say that this whole crisis globally has left what I would say traces of dysphoria on our collective souls. But I think it has also maybe left a yearning also to give ourselves a moment also to feel joy and happiness. I mean, we're entitled to it, and we're feeling like we can't allow ourselves some respite and some moment of happiness. But we are also fragile, and we can't be strong all the time. So yeah, I will leave it there, and maybe my sisters will inspire me more with bigger strength. Maybe I'm just feeling more vulnerable. It's this lockdowns emotionally, spiritually has not been good, because as I said, we watch with astonishment and horror with what is going on in the world, you know, from the virus itself, but more so from the measures being taken, and the inequality and the discrimination, the violence, the racism. It's been astonishing. And it's just
astonishing.
I will leave it.
I was just going to jump in to say, not to at all cut you off, but perhaps also to think about the fact that it's astonishing, but it's not astonishing on some level for groups of people for whom this is our life. When we talk about going to a new normal, this is our life. Look at what is happening. This man was killed by a police officer with a knee on his neck. That is not new. That is not new for those of us who are Black and brown peoples who have lived and survived apartheid, who have lived and survived generations of racial oppression in the US and the world over. That is not new. And it's happening in the middle of the epidemic, so people are forced to watch it. We see this every week. Just a couple of weeks ago, Arbery was killed. Another week or so ago, Breonna Taylor was killed. Another couple of weeks ago, another woman was killed when police mistakenly broke into her apartment. These things for me are not at all separated from this conversation about food, because they are about the basics of life and one's humanity and the ability to just survive. So if folks are daunted by this epidemic, try living as a Black or brown person who can't even walk outside your house, who doesn't have the freedom. I envy the freedom of someone in Iowa who can run down the street and hair blowing in the wind. When every day I have to think about my child, my partner, my father, my nephews, my brother-in-laws, my sisters, my mother. I live that reality every day. This situation right here, thankfully I'm employed, so I don't have that particular worry, but the levels of worry I have every day around just being Black in America and Black in this world, unparalleled. So for me, the epidemic, and for many Black and brown people, whether we are disabled, whether we are in same gender loving relationships, whether we are poor, middle class, upper class, only sheds the light for people who are unfamiliar or think that they are insulated. But for many of us, this is an everyday occurrence, and new normal, this is our normal, and it's got to stop. It has to stop. And the only way it'll stop is if those who try to ally themselves with Black and brown people actually recognize their privilege, recognize what Linda said, the entitlements, and rise up against the power structures, because you all do have the power. By virtue, unfortunately, of your able-bodiedness, or if it's not your able-bodiedness, it's your economic status. If it's not that, it's the color of your skin. It's a reality that we face every single day, and it is directly tied to food. So I don't discount your lamentations about what we look like going forward, but there are pockets of people who have experienced this over and over and over again, whether it was Ebola, HIV, enslavement, Reconstruction, Great Migration, civil rights. We have lived this life, so we gonna be okay. Black and brown people gonna be okay, because you know what we don't know how to do is survive without it. We always have a foot on our necks. So if that's our everyday occurrence, and this lockdown has put us in positions where we're even more subdued, where we're even more affected, we figure out ways to make it happen. We call aunties, we call uncles, we eat beans and rice, we eat corn, we eat cans of tomatoes. You know, health and nutrition be damned. We know how to take a can of beans and do a couple of things with them. Mash them one day, scoop them up the next day, go get some potatoes and add it to the rice. Nutrition, that's gonna make us get us through the next couple of days, and it's gonna feed our kids. That's sometimes what nutrition and health is. So I'm simply saying that, again, how do you survive in the meantime? Yes, I'm looking toward the future, but what I also know is this future has a past for many Black and brown people the world over, and especially in the United States. If we have any hard task ahead of us, it's reminding this generation of folks, this is not new. This is not new. We've been living in a pandemic ever since we've been in these United States, quite frankly, in one form or fashion. Native peoples have been wiped out, or had centuries, had their communities wiped out. They're very familiar. Are they being affected right now? Absolutely. But one of the things that I think Fulani said is relying upon traditions and cultural traditions, culinary traditions of togetherness, of stick-to-itness, of resilience, of make-do-itness. You know, you make do with what you got if that means you got to eat the leaves off the plants in your house. We have known how to do that. We are some of the original dumpster divers, foragers, back to the landers, all of that. So I am very confident, and while I am dismayed by what is happening, I am also extremely confident that while unfortunately we're going to lose some people, God bless their souls, we are going to lose some people through the ineptness, through the hubris, through the ridiculousness, through the racism, through all of that. Many more of us are going to survive. And our new normal is going to be to rise up in rebellion, to rise up and be like, don't think we are who our ancestors were, because we have a whole different arsenal at our disposal today. So I'm encouraged on some level, because it was time for Black and brown people to come together in solidarity and say, absolutely not. We are not going to take future generations into this same craziness that we have been dealing with for centuries. And if white Americans, white peoples throughout the world want to come on board, then we welcome that and we need that. But don't think for one moment that we won't survive it, because we will. Because that's our history, that's our legacy, that's the business of living in the meantime, because we haven't seen change. Just because we had a Black president in the United States doesn't mean we saw change. Not because Obama couldn't do it, but because we didn't see change. And some of us were aware of that. We couldn't see change. He had to be president for everybody, not just one segment of the population. So we know what it means like to live through upheaval. We constantly live it. So again, I implore you, as you have these conversations about food, think in terms of how resilience looks and how it has looked historically. How did it look during the era of Mandela? How does it look during the era of Obama? How does it look today? How did it look centuries ago, when Native and Africans and the settlers, the colonial settlers who came to this country, who felt like they had the power? How did it look back then? Again, the future, the present has a past. And what we should be doing is arming ourselves with the knowledge of that past, of how we made it through centuries of crazy, so that we know what our roadmap is for the future. This is not new. This isn't new. The Great Depression hit in the United States and it crippled people. But you know what? Some of those people were already crippled, and they just kept on keeping on. I'm gonna still go down to this creek and I'm gonna fish. You know, over here, I'm still living this alley life. I'm gonna go over to Miss Margaret and I'm gonna share a tomato with her, because I got green beans and I have and I have onions, and she has potato, and we're gonna pull it together and we're gonna make it work, because somebody's got it. If anything, this has reinforced the fact that as communities of people, we need to pull together more, because we cannot rely upon systems of power that are intent upon keeping us oppressed, suppressed, disenfranchised at the bottom. And it's time for us to say no more. And we need everybody on board with that particular message so that these conversations that we have about food that we think are luxurious and that are privileged can actually get at the people that we want to help thrive, which includes us. So I'm encouraged, quite frankly, because this is a watershed moment like none other. And it only really is a watershed moment because people who aren't used to being oppressed now see themselves unable to move about with the freedoms that they are used to having. Those of us who know the peril of walking out our door, this is not new. And our goal moving forward is to change that paradigm and to change that dynamic so that my grandchildren, should I have some, and my child can walk about this earth in freedom without fear of anything because of the color of her skin. So that would be how I would leave off. And again, thank you. Didn't mean to interrupt you, but wanted to add to what it was you were saying on the other side of that lamentation to provide a bit of perspective and perhaps encouragement as we move forward.
No, thank you very much, Psyche. I mean, that was powerful. There's a wonderful, rich set of presentations infused by the conversations and the questions and comments by people on this platform. I think we'll do quite an injustice to try to summarize what has been said, but I just make a few closing comments from my side before I hand over to Desiree. I think, you know, there's a wonderful synergy between all presentations in so many different ways, but certainly diverging, well, synergizing insofar as the fact that there's also complex questions raised and no easy answers. But what is really powerful for me, you know, listening into the conversation is really the importance of the intellectual and the political in all of this, and indeed also the material, the embodied issues in all its diversity. But more important than that, also the big question about the fact that while the pandemic stares us in the face, it's present, it's current, we should not forget about the interconnected struggles that continue, what many of you have said, the other pandemics that are parallel, that speak to the exploitation of people, capital, labor, racisms, classism, gender issues, and there are many more. And in fact, all of this is kind of, you know, centralized around broader questions of poverty and inequality. I mean, food is certainly a lens through which we could look at it, but it's, you know, it opens up a whole range of issues. So I want to say thank you to all of you from my side, as a co-chair, for the generosity of ideas, but also sharing perspectives of how we can look into the future, not in a Nostradamus kind of way, but in a real, tangible way around the challenges that lie ahead and what we can do. Desiree, perhaps to you?
Thank you, Vasu. I really don't think I'll even attempt the kind of summarizing that you've done now. It's been an incredibly dense and rich conversation, and I'm going to have a lot to digest. I just want to thank so much the panelists for joining us and for sharing with us in such a passionate way. I think the conversation between South Africa and the US is extremely important. Generally, cross-national conversations are vital right now. It's very disturbing that we often retreat into our little kind of camps and have these insular conversations where what is needed are global conversations and global forms of action. So for me, this is something that hopefully we will take forward. And I want to ask people who are on this list to just keep a lookout for announcements of further talks. But for now, yes, I think I will just say thank you very much. Psyche, Mariam, Carla, and of course, everybody who participated.
Thank you all so much for giving us this platform.
Thank you for making the space, and also thank you for the questions and the engagements and the.
Stay safe.
Thank you, Mariam. Thanks, Psyche.
Thank you, Mariam.
Thanks, Carla. Thanks, Vasu. And
Thank
goodbye,
you.
everybody.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.